Have you ever heard of Yi Sun-shin? If you're Korean, you definitely have. If you're Japanese, maybe not. You see, Yi Sun-shin was the Korean admiral that defeated the Japanese at sea not once, but twice in the Imjin War. Haven't heard of that either? The Imjin War was fought between the Japanese warlord samurai and wannabe shogun, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, in the Kingdom of Korea from 1592 to 1597. The war was a stunning defeat for the Japanese, who had planned to use the takeover of Korea as a stepping stone for their planned invasion of China. Here's one more thing. If you're American, you likely think that the first ironclad ships were the Monitor and the Merrimac of the US Civil War. Wrong. Though the battle between the American ironclads was seen by reporters from all over Europe and did revolutionize naval warfare, Admiral Yi Sun-shin designed and deployed the first ironclad ships against Japan in the Imjin War. The Japanese, or at least its military, never forgot the humiliation that resulted from their defeat in the Imjin War, and when the time came, they made the Korean people pay for it severely. Welcome to A Day in History, where we bring you information about the dark, unusual, or the relatively unknown events in history. The relationship between Japan and Korea goes back centuries, back to the beginning of recorded history. How could it not? Korea, and until 1953 it was just Korea, not two countries, North and South Korea, is the closest part of mainland Asia to Japan. At its closest points, mainland Japan and mainland Korea are just over 130 miles, 209 kilometers apart across the stretch of the Pacific Ocean that separates them. The Japanese island of Tsushima lies about halfway between the two mainlands and has been used as a military and supply base for Japanese attacks in Korea and its long and brutal occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. To be fair, the Japanese aren't the ones who first invaded the others' territory. Though many people believe that the famous Mongol invasions of Japan in the 13th century was a completely Mongolian affair, tens of thousands of the sailors and soldiers of the Mongolian-ordered invasion were Korean, and most of the more than 1,000 ships of the invasion fleet were made in Korea by Koreans. Not that they had a lot of choice, because the Mongolians told them to make them. As you know, the Mongolian invasions ran into both determined Japanese resistance, and both invasions were halted by massive storms that the Japanese believed were caused by the gods to protect them, the divine wind or kamikaze. Before we go on, if you haven't already, you might want to check out 3 of our other videos. The unspeakable things that happened at the Nanking incident, the unspeakable things that happened in Unit 731, and the diabolical history of the comfort women of World War II, for some background about Japan's development into an imperialist power in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the rise of fascism in Japan in the 1930s. In 1894–95, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. With that victory, the Japanese had hoped that Korea, a territory that had been giving tribute to China for centuries, would fall under its control. It didn't, because Imperial Russia had military and economic interests in Korea that it was willing to go to war to defend. So, in 1904–1905, Japan and Russia went to war, partly over the question of who would be the dominant power in Korea. To the shock of almost everyone except the Japanese, Russia was defeated. And in the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war and which won American President Theodore Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in sponsoring and hammering out the treaty, Japan was recognized as having control over Korea, though no one asked the Koreans about it. The Japanese control of Korea fell a little short of outright conquest, however. And by 1910, the Japanese had managed to put themselves in an economic, political, and military position that made Korea an occupied Japanese colony. As we've said before on this channel, we've got nothing against the Japanese people or government of today, or since 1945. But it's important to know that there are parts of Japanese history that are downplayed or even completely ignored in Japanese textbooks, and that's not right. The United States government has played a role in this too, as you know from watching our other videos. After World War II, the USA, while dominating Japan, was still wary of alienating its people, for it needed Japan as an outpost against the Soviet Union and Communist China in Asia. And so the history of the Japanese occupation of Korea. That said, we're going to use a word that many people might think is inaccurate: genocide. The word genocide was coined in 1944 by Polish-born Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, after he had escaped Poland and moved to the US. Lemkin convinced diplomats at the UN to use the term to describe not only the Holocaust of World War II, but other instances of the mass murder of people based on race and ethnicity. However, since that time, international bodies and the International Criminal Court at The Hague in Holland have expanded the meaning of the term to include any actions believed to have the aim of eradicating a particular culture from a territory. This can include mass murder, but also the elimination of a language, the alteration or elimination of a people's history, or the re-education of a populace in order to eliminate their ties with a particular culture and replace it with a new one, as the Russians have been accused of in Ukraine. In the comments of many of our videos, viewers have asked us to cover war crimes and other events in American history. To be clear, what the indigenous peoples of the United States experienced in America's expansion to the Pacific was a genocide, and the aspects of it are still being felt today. This is what happened in Korea during Japanese rule, even before the rise of the ultra-nationalist governments of the 1930s in Japan. Almost immediately after announcing the annexation of Korea and moving more troops into and throughout the country, the Japanese made it clear who was in charge and forced the last emperor of Korea, Sunjong, born 1874, died 1926, to abdicate the throne. His father, Kodong or Kojong, had been overthrown by the Japanese in 1907, and they had placed Sunjong on the throne as a puppet emperor, a ruler in name only who took orders from the military government of the Japanese. By 1910, Japan decided they no longer needed Sunjong, and he lived the rest of his life under a luxurious but tightly controlled house arrest in the Chingdekgong Palace in Seoul. Moving troops into Korea and deposing its ruler were only two things the Japanese did to further their control of the Korean peninsula. The more insidious part came next. They attempted to make the Koreans Japanese and erase Korean history. As a result, children growing up under Japanese rule were to have virtually no knowledge of their own culture and history, at least as far as the Japanese were concerned, and they did their best to ensure their control spread from the top to the bottom of Korean society. One of the first things they did was to seize over 200,000 historical documents from archives, libraries, and other government buildings, including palaces and universities. These were some of the foundational documents of the Korean state, its history, and its culture. It was the equivalent of a foreign power invading the United States before the digital age and burning the original copies of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the National Archives. Yes, you'd be mad too. Next, they forbade the use of Korean in schools and universities. Curriculum about Korea and the Korean language was removed and forbidden. In their place, students were taught about Japanese history and reverence and loyalty to the emperor, the Japanese emperor. Villagers were given rudimentary instruction in Japanese and risked a beating or more if they attempted to speak Korean to a Japanese soldier or official, or were overheard using Korean in public. As in Nazi Germany, young Korean children were encouraged to report their parents for speaking Korean or participating in anti-Japanese activities. Luckily for Korea, reverence for ancestors and respect for parents runs very deep in the culture, and instances of children reporting their parents were relatively rare. Much of Korean's farmland was held in common, meaning villagers shared land use around their settlements. Since there were no official owners, the Japanese took control of the land. They did offer it for sale back to the locals, but at hugely inflated prices. Of course, no subsistence farmer could afford the cost. After a small window of opportunity, the Japanese colonial government offered the land cheaply to the more than 100,000 Japanese settlers streaming into the country. Soon, many Korean villages, especially in the south, were surrounded by Japanese-owned land. This resulted not only in more Japanese control, but widespread hunger. Over the years before World War II, many Koreans fled to Manchuria and Japan. That sounds strange considering that Manchuria was under Japanese control from 1931 on, and Japan was Japan. But in both those territories, the laws were not as restrictive, so there was at least some opportunity to find work. Many ethnic Koreans in northern China today, which includes Manchuria and Japan, are descendants of the people that fled Japanese-controlled Korea. Many of the people who didn't go overseas and who could not or would not live in tightly controlled Japanese territory fled to the mountains and woods of Korea to eke out an existence there. Anyone who has spent time in Korea will tell you that even in most of the South, Korean winters are unbelievably harsh, with much of the winter spent far below zero, and it's windy, incredibly windy. The Japanese settlers immediately began transforming their new lands into something that looked more like Japan than Korea. Thousands of trees were cut down for timber and other reasons, and Japanese species were planted in their place. The land in Korea that was not already used to grow rice was converted to growing it to feed the growing population of Japan. Even the rice crop of already planted areas was sent to the Japanese homeland. Koreans were forced to subsist on potatoes and what little grain was grown in the country. The health of the Korean people suffered greatly as a result, and many lived on the edge of survival. In the cities of Korea, which were much fewer, smaller, and further apart than they are now, there was a relatively small but growing industrial sector. The Japanese took them over, and what's more, in the years before World War II, over 700,000 Koreans were forcibly sent to Japan as industrial workers. Perhaps most humiliatingly, Koreans were forced to both take on Japanese-sounding names and worship at Shinto temples. Shinto is the native religion of Japan. As a result, it's estimated that perhaps 85% or more of Koreans changed their names, but many chose names that sounded Japanese but had a distinctly Korean meaning, most of them intensely patriotic. On March 1, 1919, Kodong, the former emperor and father of the last Korean emperor, died. Kodong was an important symbol to most Koreans, as he was the last independent ruler of the country. Hundreds of thousands of people from the countryside and many more in Seoul attended his funeral, which quickly turned into a march for independence and democracy. We think you know how the Japanese responded. Nearly 50,000 people were arrested, and 10,000 were indicted and served long prison sentences or executed. During the demonstrations, which spread nationwide, about 7,500 Koreans were killed, and 16,000 were wounded. A similar event happened in 1926, when Kodong's son, Sunjong, died on June 10th. As a result, demonstrations took place throughout Korea with similar results. Two leaders of this time, Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung, later became the leaders of South and North Korea respectively. Things got even worse for Korea as Japan began World War II in the Pacific, first with its attack on China in 1936, and then its surprise attack on the Americans at Pearl Harbor. As you may have seen in our Unit 731 video, by the late 1930s, the Japanese had become an exceedingly racist and nationalistic fascist state. The Koreans were among the many groups of people who suffered from Japanese rule during the 30s and into the first part of the 1940s. Hundreds of thousands of Korean men, maybe 1 million or more, were forced to labor for the Japanese. In Korea, the conditions were extremely bad, but not as horrible as it was for those Koreans sent to China or elsewhere in the Japanese Empire to work for the Japanese Army and Navy. Tens of thousands were forced to work in coal and iron mines in extremely hazardous conditions. More were forced to work on defensive projects throughout the empire, and over 200,000 more were forced into the Japanese army, where they were used as occupation troops and more often as cannon fodder. Nearly 25,000 Koreans were killed serving in the Japanese army, and more than 60,000 Korean civilians lost their lives, and Korea was not invaded in the war. Many of those who died were the disgustingly named comfort women, used by Japan as sexual slaves during the war. It's thought that most of the women used in such a way during the war were Korean, though the Japanese military was an equal opportunity oppressor, and women from many of the areas conquered by Japan were used this way. What's more, many poor Japanese girls and women were also duped into this service by the Japanese military. The comfort woman issue still haunts relations between South Korea and Japan today, as does a lack of curriculum in Japanese schools about what happened in Japanese-controlled Korea 35 years ago. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting and underreported content, and press the notification bell to find out when our newest videos have dropped.